All right, well, happy 2024. That is a weird thing to say. Every year it's a weird thing to say. It is crazy to me that it's 2024. The last few weeks have been a blur for me and for my family. But I think it's pretty cool that we were able to kick off the new year with celebrating new life in Christ. And so if you guys see Mason afterward, he's a pretty soft-spoken kid. He's probably not going to want the attention. But if you see him afterward, make sure to tell him congratulations. January is an interesting time. January is a season where whether you are a goal-oriented person or not, we kind of all tend to think about where we've been, think about where we're headed. And if you're a goal-oriented person, you may even set resolutions. You may write them down and put them somewhere where you'll remember to look at them. And if you're not that formal, you probably don't do those things. But for most everybody that I know, there's at least some aspect of kind of thinking about where we've been, thinking about where we're going, and what it's going to take to get some different things in our lives in January. So every year, I try to do a series in January that deals with that kind of thing, and the series that we're kicking off today is no different. So today, we're kicking off this series called Fundamentals, where we're going to talk about small things that make a big difference in our faith. Now, I grew up playing a lot of sports. I started out playing soccer. I played that for a lot of years. I eventually decided I don't like running, and so I decided to give up that in favor of sports where I could run a shorter distance. Played a lot of baseball. I eventually golfed competitively. But my favorite sport by far was basketball. And unfortunately, I stopped growing way too short to do anything with that, but I loved it. Played a lot of basketball, years and years, lots and lots of basketball. And in every sport that I ever played, whether it was competitively or even just kind of non-competitively, there was an important thing that I had to do, which was learn the fundamentals of that particular sport. And if you grew up playing sports, you understand this too, right? Fundamentals are huge. In fact, in a lot of cases, if you have two teams that are fairly evenly matched athletically, the team that is better at the fundamentals is likely going to be the team that wins when they play each other. It's just the way it is. Fundamentals are everything. Fundamentals are huge. With our faith, it's the same way. The problem is that for a lot of us, we tend to put a lot of complexity around our faith. We tend to have a hard time kind of stripping it back and going, okay, what are the key things that matter the most? What are the key things that if I do them will make a huge difference? And so that's what we're looking at in this series. We're taking 4 weeks and we're going to look at 4 very fundamental faith behaviors, faith actions, faith things that if we'll do them regularly, will make a gigantic difference in our life. And whether you're new in your faith, whether you've been walking with Jesus a long time, being reminded of these things, if you've been walking with Jesus for a long time, is super good, super healthy, and super helpful. But if you haven't been walking with Jesus long, there's a lot of things you could try to focus on, but I'm going to try to narrow it down, zero in on the most critical things, I believe, to make your walk with Christ really, really, really strong. All right? So, to start with, we are going to talk about an intimate relationship with God. There is nothing that is more fundamental to our faith than having intimacy in our relationship with God. The truth is that God created us for this. If you look at the Bible, if you read the Bible, at the very, very beginning of the Bible, there's the book of Genesis. At the very beginning of the book of Genesis, we find the account of God creating. And when he creates people. And when he does, it says that he walks with us. He walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day in the garden that he made. At the very beginning, God created people to walk with him intimately. But then some things happen, it gets messed up. And basically for the rest of human history, we've been chasing after that intimacy. For a lot of us, we have a relationship with God. We've made a decision to follow him. But for whatever reason, we struggle to feel that closeness to God on a regular basis. And there's a really significant reason for that Jesus actually identifies in the book of Matthew. So we're going to start looking at that today to kind of try to identify why is it that if we were made for this level of intimacy and closeness with God, why is it that it's hard for us sometimes to find that or to feel that? So Matthew chapter 15, Jesus says this, these people, and he's referring to a specific group, but I'll get back to that in a moment. He says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. Now again, Jesus in this moment is referring to and describing a very specific group of people known as the Pharisees. They were religious teachers. But what Jesus is doing is he's actually quoting a man named Isaiah. Several hundred years before, there was a prophet by the name of Isaiah, and his job was to talk to God's people, the nation of Israel, on behalf of God. So to give them God's words, his messages. Jesus would have been intimately familiar with this. He would have known exactly what all these words were. And as he said this, he was quoting what Isaiah said. And when Isaiah said it, it was more broad. I want to read you what Isaiah's words actually were. Isaiah said, the Lord says, again to the nation of Israel, these people, referring to the whole nation of Israel, these people come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me, so Jesus switched it a bit here to make it contextual, but Isaiah's was more broad. He says, their worship of me is based on merely human rules that they have been taught. And this illustrates the fundamental problem that we have, that I have, that you have, that all people for all generations other than Jesus have had in our relationship with God. That we have this gravitational pull. We have this natural tendency to move away from relationship with God and into religion toward God. There was a corny Christian cliche that I first remember hearing probably when I was a young teenager, I don't know, a long time ago. It's not about religion, it's about relationship, right? If you've been in the church for any period of time, you've heard some version of that. And it's a corny cliche, but it's a very, very true cliche. God has never been interested in our religious practice or our words. He's been interested in our hearts. He wants us. He wants intimacy. But we as people like religion because it's easy to measure how good we're doing in religion. It's a lot harder to accept the fact that, like, in relationships, sometimes you don't always know exactly where you stand. You don't always have, like, a rubric by which to grade it. With religion, we can say, like, there's this behavior and this and this and this, and if you do all these things, then you're good to go. And so we like that because it gives us a feeling of control, a feeling of understanding, a feeling of like, I get this and I know what I need to do to be in good standing with God. But God isn't interested in us doing things just to be in good standing. He's interested in who we are. He wants us. The reality is our relationship with God, although we don't always think about it in these terms, is not that much different than our relationship with anybody else. In any relationship that you have, in any relationship that I have, if that relationship is primarily founded on, I'm like checking all the boxes of what it looks like to have a good relationship with this person, but I'm not giving them my heart and who I am, that relationship doesn't get healthier, right? And at some point, that relationship's probably going to go south. Because it's not about them and it's not about you, it's about some list. And similarly for us, I believe what Jesus is getting at here as he's quoting Isaiah is this very idea. Their hearts are, they come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. This is our problem. Our mouths are close, but our hearts are far. So, what we're going to do is we're going to look to the life of Jesus, to some of his words, and more critically, some of his actions, some of his behavior, to try to figure out what does it actually look like to give God our hearts. If that's what he's after, if that's what Jesus says is the problem so often for us, if that's what Isaiah identified, then how do we give God our hearts? What does that actually look like? We're going to start off by looking in the Garden of Gethsemane. So this particular story happened the night that Jesus was arrested. Now, if you're not familiar with Jesus' life, he lived about 33 years on earth, and when he was 33, he was betrayed by, he had made a bunch of people mad, and he was betrayed by one of his closest followers who sold him to the Roman authorities so that they could arrest him and they were going to put him on trial and try to kill him. Jesus had made a lot of religious people very, very angry, and they wanted to be done with this guy who was causing problems. And so this particular story, this particular night, we find Jesus and his disciples in this garden just outside Jerusalem. And it was the day that he was arrested and the day before he was going to be crucified. Now, Jesus had already told the disciples what was coming. That's important context because Jesus knew what was going to happen. So as we pick up the story, Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 39, they've walked into the garden, the disciples have kind of stopped, most of them have stopped. They went a little further, a couple more of them stopped, and then we pick up in verse 39, going a little farther, he, being Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground, and he prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. There's some really important stuff happening here. For starters, at a very baseline level, Jesus is communicating with God, right? So prayer is just communication with God. That's it. That is a critical piece to our intimacy with him. No relationship can survive well without communication, right? We understand this. So Jesus is communicating, but he's not just communicating, he's communicating with an extreme level of honesty. I think one of the things, this is a little bit of an aside, this isn't the main point today, but I think one of the things that we sometimes get wrong in our relationship with God is that we assume we can't be honest with him because it somehow expresses doubt in him. So in other words, if we're struggling with something we feel like God is asking us to do, sometimes we hold back on telling God that we're struggling with that. But Jesus right here models for us that that's absolutely okay. Jesus says to his Father, I don't want to do what I have to do. If there's any other way, please let it happen. But then he closes with something critical. Yet, not what I want, but whatever you want. I'm in. Now, communication, I said it a moment ago, but communication is absolutely crucial to our intimacy with God. That's the easy piece. Most of us, if we've been a Christian for very long, we know this, right? We know that communicating with God matters. Again, like any other relationship, any human relationship, you can't develop intimacy if you don't communicate. Not possible. You can't really even develop intimacy if you don't communicate honestly, right? So this makes sense. But with God, there is one other very critical piece that Jesus models. So a bit later in the story, we're going to skip ahead a little bit to Matthew 26, starting in verse 52. But a little while later in the story, what's happened is Jesus has continued praying. He's talked with the disciples a bit. And then finally, the guards come to arrest Jesus. As they do, one of Jesus' followers, a guy named Peter, who is known for being a little brash and a little bit impulsive. Peter decides to pull out a sword against a Roman army. And as he does, he cuts off one of the guards' ears, and Jesus steps in that moment and says something that is incredibly profound. He says, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and that he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" Don't miss the significance of this. Jesus has just spent time praying and asking God to do it a different way. And now, as Peter steps in and tries to take control, which, by the way, is exactly what we all try to do in the midst of what God wants to do in our lives, we try to step in and control it in a way that makes sense to us. Jesus says, no, Peter, stop. Don't you think that I have the power to change this if I wanted to? So I could call on God the Father right now, and he would send me legions of angels. I could make this go differently. But if I did that, then the plan that God has already established and that he has already communicated can't happen. So I'm not going to do that. The significance of what Jesus says here is massive. Because it's not just words with Jesus when he says, "Yet not my will, but your will." His words, his mouth isn't just close to God the Father, but his heart is. Jesus is so committed to God the Father that he's willing to lay down everything in order to obey what God the Father has asked. So when Jesus says, "You honor me with your mouth, but your heart is far from me," what Jesus models for us is exactly the opposite of that. Jesus models what it looks like for our hearts to be close to the Father. He does it by communicating honestly with him, but critically, he does it by being obedient to what God asks. So if you want to build intimacy with God, it's similar to the way we build intimacy with people. You've got to communicate. But you cannot build intimacy with God without obedience. So, if you want to set up your faith for success, the most critical thing, I genuinely believe, the most critical thing that you can do in your life is communicate and obey. That's how we do it. We build intimacy with God through obedience and through communication. That's how we build it. And this is one of the places that I think a lot of people get it wrong. We assume that the way we build intimacy with God is just communication. But if our communication is void of obedience, then we aren't following God at all. We're following us with God along as a friend. See, with people in our life, we don't have to obey each other because you aren't God and I'm not God. So us as friends, we can be friends and we can talk and we can build intimacy through that. But with God, there's a critical piece that's different. The only way that we express to God that we believe he is who he says he is through our obedience to him. And without that, we're short-circuiting our ability to have intimacy. And so for some of us today, maybe you've been walking with God and maybe you've been doing your best to pray and to seek him that way, but maybe you're still feeling a void of intimacy in your life. Maybe a question that you need to ask yourself is, am I just communicating with God about what I want and what I need? Because if that's all your communication with God is, you're not going to develop intimacy. You're not. Because what you're demonstrating to God is that you are God and he is not. And I know that's a harsh way to say that, and I'm not saying that that's anyone's intention. I don't ever believe that's someone's intention. But in reality, what we see Jesus do is say, God, this is what I want, but if it's not your plan, then okay, I'm in on your plan. I will do what you have said. Now, it's interesting to me that Jesus had this conversation, this first conversation that we looked at in Matthew 26:39, where Jesus says, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Jesus didn't just have that conversation with God once. He actually had it 3 times, just back to back to back. Matthew chapter 26, verse 42, we see it again. It says, he went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. So again, demonstrating the same thing. And then in Matthew 26:44, just 2 verses later, so he, being Jesus, he left them and went away once more and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same thing. What does it look like to give your heart to somebody? It looks like being honest and being vulnerable, communicating, being real with them. I think it's pretty profound that Jesus didn't just do this once. To me, once feels like a religious checkbox. You know, like if it's religion, I can be like, well, I prayed, check, I did it. I mean, maybe you could say, well, religion is I pray 3 times, check, Jesus did it. But clearly what Jesus is demonstrating here is that when your heart is burdened, when your heart is heavy, go to God. Go to God. Go to God. As many times as it takes, go to God. But again, what Jesus is modeling is not just words, but he's modeling actions. Jesus clearly really doesn't want to go through what he's going to have to go through. Jesus is modeling that it is absolutely okay to not like what God is asking you to do. That's another area that I think sometimes robs us of intimacy. We think like if God asks us to do a thing and then we're like, okay, I'll do it, but I really don't want to. That like begrudgingly going along with it is somehow pleasing to God. But that's not being honest. It's not being vulnerable. That's not giving God your heart. And so Jesus goes back 3 times. It's okay to not like what God's asking you to do, and it's okay to express it to him. But what Jesus ends with is key. A moment ago, I read Matthew 26:52 through 44. We're going to pick back up for our last place in Scripture here, just right after that, Matthew 26:55. So Jesus has just said, how then would the Scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way? And then he doubles down again. It says, in that hour, Jesus said to the crowd. So now he's addressing his people, not just Peter, but everybody. He says, am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. In other words, what Jesus does as he addresses everyone is he says God had a plan in place. God knew what he was doing. He's done all this for a reason. I could have been arrested any time, but everything has come to this moment, this particular moment, for a reason. And if that's what God the Father had in mind, then that is what we're going to do, period, end of story. Again, keeping in mind that just a few minutes before this, Jesus went to God the Father 3 times and said, please let it go another way. Please let it go another way. Please let it go another way. But he didn't end there. He said, not my will, but yours. And then when push came to shove, he behaved in a way that honored what God had said, not what he desired. And as the story continues, Jesus is arrested. He's put on trial. He is falsely accused. He is convicted of crimes he did not commit. He is beaten to within an inch of his life, and he is nailed to a Roman cross. All is a display of the power and the might of Rome. But that's not the end. But in all of it, the power in this story is that Jesus asked God the Father to change it. Jesus asked God the Father to do things differently so it wouldn't hurt, so that it wouldn't cost him as much. That sounds like a prayer that I would pray. That sounds like a prayer that maybe you would pray. You know, I think we have this picture in our mind sometimes of Jesus as like I'm doing what God said and I'm stoic about it and I'm okay and it doesn't affect me. That's not the case. If you actually look into the Greek, in the original, the first verse that I read on that, going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed. The implication there was that he was so overwhelmed with pain and sadness and fear, which sounds an awful lot to me like an anxiety attack. And he just fell. Like his body couldn't physically bear the weight of what he was carrying emotionally. And there's power in that. And there's power in the way Jesus goes to the Father and said, please, let it be done another way. But the power, the most power, is found in Jesus saying, yet not my will, but yours, and then acting on it. Jesus had a more intimate relationship with God the Father than anyone else ever has. And so if we want to know what it looks like to have intimacy with God the Father, we build it through communication and obedience. But what Jesus does here, and for us, very, very simply, if you want to develop real, lasting intimacy with God the Father, there is a simple habit that you can put in place in your life. It's the fundamental. Constantly ask God, what do you want me to do? And respond, yes. That's it. What do you want me to do? And then respond, yes. That's what we see in Jesus' life. Father, here's what I want, but I'm not going to do what I want. What do you want? I'll do that. Father, this is what I really want this, but not what I want. I'll do what you want. Okay, we've had this conversation a couple times. Please. But not what I want, what you want. See, we have this habit, as Jesus identified in what we looked at first. We have this habit of making our relationship with him religious in nature. We have this habit of saying, well, if I can just check the box off, this might feel like checking the box off, but here's the thing. God's never going to give you a checklist of stuff. He's just going to give you one thing at a time and ask, will you do that? And when you do that, then he might give you a next thing, and then a next thing, and then a next thing, and then a next thing. But where so many people get this wrong, and where I have gotten this wrong in my life at times, is God asks us to do a thing, and we go, oh, Father, if there be any other way, let this cup pass from me. I'm just going to go ahead and wait a while. Maybe I heard you wrong. Maybe I heard you wrong. I think I heard you wrong. Let's talk again later. And then we circle back, and we have the same conversation, and we hear the same thing from God, but then we say, oh, I don't know, maybe I heard you wrong, and we overthink everything, and we make everything complex. The simple question is, what is God asking me to do? And am I doing it? And that's it. And if you make a habit of doing that through your life, of communicating with God honestly and openly, and when he asks you to do things you don't like, saying, God, I don't want to do that, but if that's what you want, I will do it. If you'll make a habit of asking, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? And then just simply responding, okay, I'll do it. And then doing it. Communication and obedience. If you'll do those things, an intimacy with God will begin to develop. A trust in God will begin to develop. A confidence in God will begin to develop that you cannot possibly develop on your own. So, as a church, I've tried really, really hard to make sure that as a church, we don't just do stuff that sounds good or that it's well, that's a spiritual thing to do. We try to do things that help people take steps in their faith. And so, listen, at the end of the day, this habit, just constantly throughout your life, constantly asking God, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? God, what do you want? God, what do you want? God, what do you want? And then responding yes, you don't need anything to help you do that. You can do that perfectly fine on your own. There was some mention earlier in the service today, I think in the announcement video, about 7 days of prayer. The reason why we do 7 days of prayer in January and in August is to give people an environment where they can begin to do different or new things in their relationship with God in the way they communicate with him. And so starting tomorrow, we're kicking off a week of prayer services here in the evenings. And part of the goal of that is if you're like, I'd really like to do this, but I just forget, and I'm too busy, and I don't know how to carve out the time. Well, we've provided an opportunity for you the next week to just carve out the time. There's a starting time and there's an ending time. You don't have to come. Coming to those services doesn't actually make it easier to do this at all, except that there's an environment that's already created and curated to hopefully help you pray. And it's from 7 o'clock to 7:45. You might think 45 minutes, that's a long time. There's all kinds of different stuff here. If you've got kids, we're going to have all kinds of kids' prayer stations in the back. Bring your kids and model for them what it looks like to pray. It's one of the best things you can do as a parent. We've got all kinds there's prayer requests all over. There's all kinds of different prompts and all kinds of different things that you can do to spend time praying. We've made it as easy as possible. The point is, you don't need that to pray this prayer. But if you're like, man, I'd really like to do this, but I just don't know how to get started, well, then come. Just come hang out and pray for a little bit and pray this prayer. If you come, what you're going to find is that I pace when I pray. I learned a few years back, that's the only way I can focus. If I sit still, I can't focus. It's a train wreck. So I just walk laps around the room. It's great. I get my steps in those days. I just walk laps and I pray. And often, I just am asking that and just listening and listening. And some days I hear things, and some days I hear nothing. And I just keep asking. And when God says something, sometimes I'm like, oh, God, if there's any other way. And some days I'm like, okay. And other days I'm like, no, I think I misheard you. We'll come back tomorrow. I do all the same things you do. Again, to repeat, you don't have to come to 7 days of prayer to be a part of doing this. You can do it on your own completely 100%. But if you want an easy environment to begin to put it into place, that's an option for you. Now, my hope is, regardless of all that, regardless of whether you come to 7 days of prayer or not, my hope is that as a result of this, you'll be able to strip out some of the complexity. All the different things that you might think, well, this would be a good thing to do, this would be a good thing to do this, none of it matters. The question is simply, what's God asking you to do right now? That's it. So my hope is on the back end that you'll be able to start doing this. Day in, day out, moment in, moment out. And that as God begins to reveal something to you, that you'll simply say yes. And listen, if you come to 7 days of prayer, we'll count the people, and then we'll write a number down, and cool, there's numbers that we have to look at. But if you pray that, I want you to understand, that doesn't benefit me or our church. So this isn't about me. It's not about our church. It's a fundamental. It's about you. It's about your faith. It's about your health. It's about your intimacy with God. More than anything else as a pastor, what I desperately want for you, for all of us, for our church, what I desperately, desperately want is for you to have an intimacy with God, an ability to hear his voice, an ability to respond to him with obedience that is present, that is firm, that is confident, no matter your circumstances. Because when you get to that place in your faith, it does not matter what comes your way. You've placed your faith on a rock, that can't be shaken. That's what I want for us. And so my hope this week, in the coming weeks, as we talk about other fundamentals, start here. Do this one. See where it takes you. And in the end, if you've struggled to find intimacy with God before, I think you'll find it with him through something as simple as asking God, what do you want me to do? And responding yes.